Lake Titicaca is the highest large navigable lake in the world. It sits on the Altiplano, the high plateau of the central Andes on the border between Peru and Bolivia at 3,812 m above sea level. It covers approximately 8,372 kilometers. It is approximately 190 kilometers long. Its maximum depth reaches approximately 281 m, nearly 922 feet. It has been the center of human civilization in this region for more than 10,000 years. In late 2023 and into 2024, the lake began to fall. A severe drought driven by a strong El Niño event combined with below-average rainfall across the Andean Altiplano and accelerated evaporation at high altitude drew the lake toward levels not seen in decades. Satellite and gauge data showed the water approaching the historic low recorded in 1996. Boats that had floated for years were left stranded on dried mud. Fish died in the shrinking shallows. The Tora reed beds that fringe the lake, the reeds that local communities depend on for building, for fishing, and for their very homes began to dry out. And the URU, the indigenous community who live on artificial floating islands made of those same reeds on the Peruvian side of the lake, found their entire way of life threatened as the water receded. There are two stories here. They are both real. They are not the same story. What the Belgian-Bolivian underwater archaeology team recovered from the submerged reefs near the island of the sun, and what those objects reveal about the civilization that placed them there. What the falling waters of 2023 and 2024 are now threatening above the surface and below it. Why the honest version of this story is more consequential than the version most coverage has told. The first story, music, is the drought. The drought is real, recent, and serious. It is an ecological and humanitarian crisis that has affected fishing communities, agricultural communities, and especially the URU people whose floating reed islands depend on the lake remaining at a healthy level. The drought is the news event, the thing that happened in 2023 and 2024 and drew international attention to the lake. The second story is the archaeology. Beneath the surface of Lake Titicaca lies one of the richest collections of submerged pre-Columbian heritage anywhere in the world. Gold, ceramics, sacrificed animals, possible structures, the remnants of a civilization that flourished here more than 1,000 years ago and used the lake itself as a sacred space for ritual offerings. But the archaeology was not exposed by the drought. The famous discoveries beneath Lake Titicaca were not uncovered when the water dropped near the shore. They were found by deliberate underwater diving expeditions working at depth over years of careful scientific archaeology. The gold offerings, the puma-shaped incense burners, the sacrificed llamas, all of these were recovered by divers, not revealed by receding water. The drought did not uncover them. The drought is instead now threatening them by altering the conditions of the lake that has preserved them for over 1,000 years. The peer-reviewed record is clear on this distinction. The popular coverage of the lake has consistently described it otherwise. The honest version of the story is this. Divers found a submerged Tiwanaku world beneath Lake Titicaca, and the lake's falling waters are now putting both that submerged heritage and the living communities of the lake at risk. That is the true story. Music, it is more genuinely important than the simpler drought-revealed treasure version because it connects the deep past of the lake to its threatened present. The civilization most associated with the submerged archaeology of Lake Titicaca is the Tiwanaku, sometimes spelled Tiwano. The Tiwanaku were a pre-Columbian Andean civilization centered near the southern shore of the lake in what is now Bolivia. They flourished from approximately 500 to 1000 Common Era. The Inca, who would become far more widely known, did not rise to regional dominance until several centuries after the Tiwanaku had already reached their height and begun to decline. At their height, the Tiwanaku state was one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas. Monumental architecture, advanced agricultural systems, extensive trade networks, a complex religious cosmology in which Lake Titicaca itself played a central role. The lake was sacred to the Tiwanaku and it remained sacred to the Inca who came after them. In Andean cosmology, Lake Titicaca was the origin place of civilization itself. The island of the sun, Ela del Sol in the lake's southern basin on the Bolivian side, was in Inca mythology the birthplace of the sun god and the origin point of the first Inca. The lake was not merely a body of water. It was the center of the world, the place from which creation began, the sacred heart of the Andean spiritual landscape. Both the Tiwanaku and the Inca treated the lake as a place of profound religious significance. This is why there are ritual offerings beneath the water. The Tiwanaku deliberately deposited sacred objects into the lake as religious acts. They were not throwing things away. They were making offerings to the sacred waters, depositing valuable objects, sacrificed animals, and ritual items as part of state-sponsored religious activity. The offerings were a way of communicating with the sacred, of honoring the lake, and of demonstrating and consolidating the religious and political authority of the Tijuanaca state. The most significant scientific investigation of these offerings series was led by Christophe Dallaire, an underwater archaeologist at the University Libre de Bruxelles. Between 2013 and 2019, Dallaire and his colleagues carried out systematic underwater archaeology at Lake Titicaca, focusing particularly on a submerged reef near the Island of the Sun known as the Koa Reef. The Koa Reef turned out to be one of the most important ritual offering sites in the lake. The results of this work were published in 2019 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The paper was co-authored by José Capriles, a Bolivian archaeologist at Penn State University, and Charles Stenish, an American archaeologist who has spent decades working on Titicaca Basin and Tiwanaku archaeology. The 2019 PNAS paper is the definitive scientific publication on the submerged offerings of Lake Titicaca. What the team found at the Koa Reef was specific and documented. Gold medallions deposited into the lake as offerings lying on the submerged reef where the Tiwanaku had placed them more than 1,000 years earlier. Semi-precious stone ornaments, items made of lapis, lazuli, and sodali. Blue stones that the Tiwanaku valued and worked into ritual objects. Ceramic incense burners, some of them shaped like pumas. The puma was a sacred animal in Tiwanaku cosmology and would remain sacred in the Andean cultures that followed. The Inca, whose capital city of Cusco was, according to some interpretations, laid out in the shape of a puma, continued this reverence for centuries after the Tiwanaku had fallen. The feline form ritual vessels recovered from the lake connect directly to this deep Andean tradition. The team also recovered the remains of sacrificed animals, specifically juvenile llamas, young animals that had been sacrificed and deposited into the lake alongside the metal and ceramic items. The sacrifice of young llamas was a documented practice in Andean ritual. Finding their remains among the underwater offerings confirmed that the deposits at the Koa Reef were not casual disposals. They were deliberate, formalized ritual acts. Gold, semi-precious stones, ceramic puma vessels, sacrificed juvenile llamas. The 2019 PNS paper concluded that these offerings were deliberate ritual deposits made by the Tiwanaku state. This is an important interpretive point. The offerings were not simply expressions of personal piety. They were acts of state. By conducting elaborate, valuable ritual offerings into the sacred lake, the Tiwanaku rulers demonstrated their connection to the sacred, their control over valuable resources, and their authority to mediate between the human world and the divine. The religious activity at the lake was part of how the Tiwanaku state built and maintained its power. The gold and the llamas and the puma vessels were, in this sense, both religious offerings and political statements. This is the genuine archaeological record of Lake Titicaca, peer-reviewed, published in PNAS, the result of 6 years of careful underwater fieldwork by a serious international team. It tells us with the precision of documented evidence how one of the great pre-Columbian Andean civilizations used its sacred lake to build a state. There is a separate layer to the underwater archaeology, one that is more complicated and more contested. In the year 2000, an expedition organized by the Italian exploration group Acre Geographical Exploring conducted an extensive investigation of the lake near the Island of the Sun. The expedition carried out more than 200 dives. They reported finding submerged terraces, a wall approximately 800 m long, and various stone structures beneath the water. Popular coverage described these findings as a lost temple. Some accounts called it a submerged ancient city. The honest position on these structures is specific. The expedition did report submerged terraces, a long wall, and stone features. These reports are part of the documented record of investigation at the lake. But the precise nature of the structures, their dating, and whether they constitute a temple in the way popular coverage suggested remain debated among archaeologists. Some of the structures may be remnants of shoreline constructions that were submerged when the lake level rose over the centuries. Some may be agricultural terracing. The dramatic framing went beyond what the evidence clearly supports. The findings were noted in the published record. A systematic follow-up investigation at scale was quietly set aside. Understanding why there is underwater archaeology at Lake Titicaca requires understanding how the lake has behaved over centuries. The water level naturally fluctuates over long time periods driven by climate cycles. During periods of lower water in the past, areas that are now submerged were dry land. People built on that dry land, houses, terraces, walls, and agricultural fields. When the climate shifted and the lake level rose again, those constructions were submerged. This is why archaeological structures exist underwater in Lake Titicaca. They were not built underwater. They were built on land land that later went under the water as the lake rose. The fluctuation of the lake level over the centuries has repeatedly drowned and exposed different portions of the shoreline, creating the complex underwater archaeological landscape that divers have been investigating. This same fluctuation mechanism connects directly to the collapse of the Tiwanaku civilization itself. The Tiwanaku state declined between approximately 100 Common Era and 1100 Common Era. Researchers have linked that decline to a prolonged regional drought, a sustained period of reduced rainfall that lowered the lake and disrupted the agricultural systems the civilization depended on. The Tiwanaku had developed a sophisticated raised field agricultural system around the lake known in the local Aymara language as sukakolus. Crops were planted on raised platforms of soil separated by channels of water. The water in the channels moderated temperature, protecting the crops from the frequent frosts of the high altiplano. Provided irrigation. It returned nutrients to the soil. The sukakolu system allowed the Tiwanaku to support a large population in an environment that would otherwise have been agriculturally marginal. When the regional climate shifted and a prolonged drought lowered the lake, the sukakalu system was disrupted. The water that the raised fields depended on receded. The agricultural foundation of the Tiwanaku state was undermined and the civilization that had flourished around the lake for 5 centuries declined. The remnants of the sukakaluless raised fields are still visible around the lake during low water periods. They have been studied as evidence of the sophisticated pre-Columbian water management that sustained the Tiwanaku and whose disruption may have contributed to their fall. The drought that may have helped destroy the Tiwanaku civilization 1,000 years ago is in its mechanism the same kind of event now threatening the lake again. The 2023 to 2024 drought is a modern instance of the kind of climatic stress the region has experienced repeatedly over the centuries. The kind of stress that in the past drowned shoreline settlements when the water rose and exposed them when the water fell, and that may have contributed to the collapse of one of the great Andean civilizations. The lake has always fluctuated. The fluctuation has always had consequences for the people who depend on it. This recent episode is the most recent chapter in a very long story. The drought from 2023 to 2024 was a serious event with real documented consequences. The lake fell toward its 1996 historic low. The receding water exposed lake bed that had been underwater. Boats were stranded on dried mud, unable to reach water. Fish died as the shallows shrank and water quality declined. And the Tora reed beds, the dense stands of reeds that fringe the lake and that are critical to the local ecology and to the human communities that depend on them, began to dry out and die back. The community most directly threatened was the URU. The URU are an indigenous people who live on artificial floating islands made of Tora reeds on the Peruvian side of the lake. The Uro's floating islands are one of the most distinctive human adaptations to any environment anywhere in the world. Built entirely from layered Tora reeds, they are anchored in place and continuously maintained as the bottom layers rot and new reeds are added on top. The URU live on these islands, build their houses from the same reeds, make their boats from the reeds, and have done so for generations. Their entire way of life is built on the reeds and on the lake that grows them. The 2023 to 2024 drought threatened all of this. As the water level fell, the reed beds that the URU depend on dried out. The reeds that the islands are made of, the reeds the houses are built from, the reeds the boats are constructed of, all of them depend on a healthy lake with adequate water. When the water falls and the reed beds die, the foundation of URU life is undermined. The drought was for the URU not an abstract climate statistic. It was a direct threat to their homes, their livelihoods, and their continued existence as a community on the lake. The drought also affected the broader fishing and agricultural communities around the lake on both the Peruvian and Bolivian sides. Lake Titicaca supports significant fishing activity, and the drying of the lake damaged fish populations and disrupted the fishing economy. Agricultural communities that depend on the lake for irrigation and for the moderating effect of the large body of water on the local climate were also affected. The 2023 to 2024 drought was a genuine humanitarian and ecological crisis for the human communities of the lake. And this is where the two stories connect. Honestly, the drought did not uncover the gold offerings near the shore, but the drought and the broader pattern of climate stress it represents does threaten the submerged heritage of the lake along with the living communities. Lower water levels change the conditions that have preserved the underwater archaeology. Exposure of previously submerged sites can accelerate deterioration, expose them to looting, and disrupt the careful conditions under which scientific archaeology must be conducted. The same falling waters that threaten the Uro's Reed Islands also threaten in a different way the submerged Tiwanaku world beneath the lake. The genuine connection between the two stories is not that the drought revealed the treasure. It is that the drought endangers both the heritage beneath the water and the people living on it. The falling waters of Lake Titicaca are a threat to the past and to the present at the same time. Bolivia has has taken the submerged heritage seriously. Following the Koa Reef discoveries, the country established institutional support for underwater archaeology, including the Center for Andean Archaeology Underwater. With support from UNESCO and from Belgian institutions, Bolivia announced plans between 2019 and 2021 to build a museum at Lake Titicaca that would display the recovered artifacts and allow visitors to engage with the submerged sites. The planned museum near the Island of the Sun would be one of the few facilities of its kind in the world, a place dedicated specifically to the underwater archaeology of the sacred lake. Bolivia even maintains a navy on Lake Titicaca. Despite being a landlocked country, the Bolivian Navy has assisted archaeological and recovery operations on the lake. The lake is on UNESCO's tentative World Heritage List. Underwater and shoreline archaeological research by Bolivian, Peruvian, and international teams is ongoing. Lake Titicaca is regarded as one of the most archaeologically rich freshwater bodies anywhere on Earth. Low water periods at Lake Titicaca do periodically expose shoreline archaeological material, pottery fragments, structural remnants, and the raised field features of the Suca-Cola system. This is real and documented. When the water falls, things that were underwater become visible at the shoreline. But the major ritual offering discoveries, the gold, the ceramics, and the sacrificed llamas at the Koa Reef did not come from drought exposing them at the shoreline. They came from deliberate diving at depth conducted by trained underwater archaeologists over 6 years of careful scientific fieldwork. The drought exposes modest shoreline material. The major discoveries came from diving. These are different things. Conflating them misrepresents how the archaeology of Lake Titicaca actually works. The peer-reviewed record is clear on this point. The popular framing has quietly persisted. Regardless, one more claim circulates frequently in popular coverage of Lake Titicaca and should be addressed directly. Jim Allen, a British author whose book Atlantis, The Andes Solution, argued that sites near Lake Titicaca and the nearby Lake Pupo correspond to Plato's lost city of Atlantis, with a particular focus on a site called Pampa Alagos, has been a recurring presence in fringe literature about the lake. The theory is rejected by mainstream archaeology. There is no credible evidence connecting Lake Titicaca or anywhere else in the Andes to Plato's Atlantis. Plato's account was in any case a philosophical allegory in his dialogues, not a historical record. The genuine archaeology of Lake Titicaca does not require and is not supported by any connection to the Atlantis myth. What the genuine archaeology tells us is a story about a real civilization in a real place that used a real sacred lake as the center of its religious and political world. The Tiwanaku flourished around Lake Titicaca for 5 centuries. They built monumental architecture. They developed sophisticated raised field agriculture. They created a complex religious cosmology in which the lake was the sacred center of creation. And they deposited gold, semi-precious stones, ceramic puma vessels, and sacrificed juvenile llamas into the sacred waters as offerings that lay undisturbed on the submerged reefs for more than 1,000 years until divers found them in the years from 2010 to 2019. The lake music preserved these offerings. The cold, deep, high-altitude freshwater environment of Lake Titicaca slowed music, the deterioration of the deposited objects, keeping them recognizable across the centuries. The same lake that the Tiwanaku treated as sacred became in effect a vast underwater archive of their religious life. The divers who recovered the offerings in the years from 2010 to 2019 were reaching into that archive, pulling out objects that had been placed there by a civilization that fell 1,000 years ago. Now, the lake that preserved all of this is falling. The 2023 to 2024 drought is the most recent and most severe in a series of climate stresses the lake has experienced. The falling water threatens the living communities, the URU on their floating reed islands, the fishing communities, and the agricultural communities of both shores. And it threatens the submerged heritage by changing the conditions that have preserved it. The connection between the deep past and the threatened present is what makes the honest version of this story matter. 1,000 years ago, a drought may have helped destroy the Tiwanaku civilization by disrupting the agricultural system that depended on the lake. Today, the same kind of climate stress is threatening the descendants of the broader Andean cultural tradition that the Tiwanaku were part of, along with the submerged remnants of the Tiwanaku themselves. The lake connects both. The same body of sacred water that received the Tiwanaku offerings, that drowned the shoreline settlements when it rose, that sustained the Suca-Colu's fields, that supports the Urajuro's reed islands, is the thing that ties the entire long history of human life in this place together. It is the thing that binds past and present, and that lake is now falling. The real story of Lake Titicaca is not that the drought uncovered gold near the shore. It did not. The real story story is that the lake holds beneath its surface one of the richest collections of submerged pre-Columbian heritage in the world. That heritage was recovered by divers and published in PNAS in 2019. And the same lake in 2023 to 2024 fell toward its historic low in a drought that threatened the living communities who depend on it. And in a slower and quieter way, the submerged heritage it has preserved for over 1,000 years. The gold medallions are real. The puma-shaped incense burners are real. The sacrificed juvenile llamas are real. The semi-precious stone ornaments are real. They were placed in the lake by the Titicaca state as ritual offerings more than 1,000 years ago, and they were recovered by Christophe Dallaire and his Belgian-Bolivian team through years of careful underwater archaeology, with the results confirmed in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2019. The 2023 to 2024 drought is real. It drew the lake toward its 1996 historic low. It stranded boats, killed fish, dried the Tadora reed beds, and threatened the URU people whose entire way of life is built on the reeds and the water of the lake. The connection between them is real, not the false connection of drought revealing treasure, but the true connection of a sacred lake that holds the deep past beneath its surface and sustains the living present on its waters, now threatened by the same kind of climate stress that has shaped its long history for thousands of years. The Tiwanaku treated this lake as the center of the world. They placed their gold and their sacred objects and their sacrificed animals into its waters as offerings. The lake preserved those offerings for 1,000 years. Divers found them. Scientists published them. Bolivia is building a museum to display them. And now the lake itself, the sacred center of Andean civilization, the highest large navigable lake in the world, the body of water that has sustained human life on the Altiplano for over 10,000 years, is falling, threatening both the submerged world the Tiwanaku left behind and the living communities who still call its shores and its waters home. The drought did not reveal the gold. The divers found the gold by diving. But the falling waters are a genuine threat to the Uro's Reed Islands, to the fishing and farming communities of both shores, and to the submerged Tiwanaku heritage that the lake has guarded for 1,000 years. That threat, music, and the deep history it endangers is the real story of Lake Titicaca. Every part of it survives any fact check because every part of it is true. The lake holds the past beneath its surface. The lake sustains the present on its waters. What is now threatening both the falling water, the dying reeds, the changing conditions of the lake floor is the same kind of climate stress that 1,000 years ago may have ended the civilization that placed the gold there.